Pain arrived before consciousness, which combat experience told Sergeant Dominic Hayes meant he was still alive despite all tactical probability suggesting otherwise. His last clear memory involved plasma fire turning his squad's defensive position into superheated hell during what was supposed to be humanity's decisive engagement at the Kepler orbital platform. 3 years into a war that had started over resource disputes and escalated into the kind of interstellar conflict that consumed entire fleets without achieving anything resembling victory for either side. He forced his eyes open despite his body's strong preference for unconsciousness, his combat training overriding physical reluctance because wounded soldiers who stayed unconscious too long in hostile territory usually stayed unconscious permanently. The ceiling above him wasn't standard human military medical facility construction. Instead of reinforced composite panels with integrated lighting systems, he saw what appeared to be organic material that glowed with soft, bioluminescent blue-green light, creating illumination that felt more like moonlight than artificial sources. His tactical assessment protocols kicked in automatically, cataloging environmental details despite pain that radiated from his left side, where he remembered taking direct plasma fire, remembered his armor ablating away in superheated streams, while he tried desperately to reach cover that hadn't existed. The air smelled wrong, sterile like medical facilities, but with an underlying sweetness that human antiseptics never produced, something almost floral mixed with chemical precision. He tried to move, and his body informed him with extreme prejudice that movement was currently inadvisable. Pain flaring through ribs he suspected were either fractured or recently repaired from fractures. Then he saw her, and every combat instinct he possessed screamed warnings, even as his logical mind recognized that if she'd wanted him dead, he wouldn't have woken up at all. She was Sylvari, enemy species. The aliens' humanity had been fighting for 3 years over territorial expansion and resource allocation disputes that probably made sense to politicians, but felt increasingly meaningless to soldiers actually doing the dying. Her elongated ears were marked with silver bands that his intelligence briefings identified as medical corps insignia. Her movements between monitoring equipment precise and practiced in ways that spoke of extensive training and experience. She noticed his consciousness immediately, those ears twitching slightly in what he'd learned to recognize as Sylvari attention shift, and turned to face him with an expression his human pattern recognition struggled to interpret, until she spoke in accented but entirely comprehensible standard. "You survived," she said simply, and something in her tone, relief mixed with satisfaction mixed with what might be professional pride, made him pause instead of attempting the completely futile escape his training demanded. She approached slowly, her hands deliberately visible and empty of weapons, settling onto a stool beside what he realized was a medical bed significantly more sophisticated than anything human field hospitals deployed. "I am Healer Veslyn," she continued, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that good medics developed regardless of species. "You have been unconscious for 3 days while your body recovered from second-degree plasma burns across 17% of your surface area, 2 fractured ribs that required bone regeneration therapy, and significant blood loss that necessitated synthetic supplementation, because we lack compatible organic donors. Your species' resilience is quite remarkable from a medical perspective." Consciousness returned in waves over the following days, bringing with it fragments of memory and growing confusion about his tactical situation that his training hadn't adequately prepared him to handle. Dominic learned through careful observation and brief conversations, when pain medication permitted coherent thought, that he wasn't in a Sylvari military prison facility, or even a standard battlefield hospital, but rather in one of the neutral zone medical outposts that had developed organically at the edges of the war, where exhausted combatants from both sides had gradually established unofficial truces that allowed wounded to be treated without immediate threat of resumed hostilities. The Kepler orbital platform battle had ended in mutual devastation that his scattered memories suggested. Neither side achieved strategic objectives. Both lost ships and personnel in numbers that forced temporary ceasefire while remaining fleets regrouped, and command structures figured out whether to call it tactical withdrawal or strategic defeat. Veslyn tended his injuries with professional competence that transcended species barriers in ways that made him reconsider intelligence briefings that had characterized Sylvari as coldly efficient warriors without capacity for individual compassion. Her hands were gentle when changing bandages over plasma burns that human medical science would have left scarred, but Sylvari regeneration technology was systematically erasing without trace. She explained procedures in ways that respected his need to understand what was happening to his body, rather than treating him as passive recipient of care, never condescending despite obvious technological superiority of her medical equipment and techniques. During one particularly lucid period when pain had receded enough for extended conversation, Dominic finally asked the question that had been building since first regaining consciousness. "Why are you helping me? We're enemies. I've killed your people, not personally perhaps, but as part of military operations that have definitely resulted in Sylvari casualties. Your forces have killed mine. So why invest resources and effort in keeping me alive?" Veslyn's hands paused momentarily in their work, adjusting the plasma regeneration unit attached to his healing burns, her elongated ears shifting in ways he was beginning to interpret as emotional response rather than purely functional movement. "You spared my life once," she said quietly, resuming her professional adjustments while speaking with careful precision. "6 months ago, during the raid on the Arcturus supply depot, when human forces breached our defensive perimeter and pushed into interior facilities where we were treating wounded from the previous engagement. I was in the medical wing when your squad broke through our security. Your soldiers wanted to neutralize everyone present. Standard tactical protocol, I understand, given that wounded enemy personnel represent potential future combatants. But you ordered them to stand down, declared the medical facility off-limits to combat operations. Let us continue treating injured soldiers from both sides, including the 2 human prisoners we had captured during earlier fighting." The memory crashed back with sudden vivid clarity. The supply depot assault, desperate close quarters combat through corridors designed for species with different spatial requirements than humans, breaching that door expecting enemy soldiers, and finding instead medical personnel frantically working to save lives regardless of species affiliation. He remembered the decision, how Lieutenant Morrison had argued vehemently against showing mercy to enemy medical staff, how Dominic had pulled rank and moved his squad to secure other objectives while leaving the medical wing untouched. "I remember he managed through pain that had nothing to do with physical injuries. You were there, working on a human soldier, Martinez from 2nd Battalion, who'd been captured 2 days earlier. You were trying to save his life, using the same techniques you're using on me now." Physical recovery progressed steadily under Veslyn's expert care, and the tent became a space suspended outside the normal flow of the war, a small pocket of enforced peace where 2 representatives of civilizations locked in brutal interstellar conflict had to navigate close proximity without the familiar framework of combat to define their interactions. Dominic discovered that Veslyn was considerably more than just a skilled medical practitioner. During long hours when pain or simple restlessness kept him awake despite sedatives, she'd carefully calibrated to human metabolism. She talked about her homeworld, about Sylvari culture, and the philosophical traditions that had led her species to develop medical technology treating healing as sacred calling, rather than merely biological repair and maintenance. She explained that Sylvari elongated ears weren't simply aesthetic evolutionary development, but served functional purposes including detecting subtle environmental changes in air pressure and temperature that aided medical diagnosis. Could even read certain biological rhythms at close range, which made her people naturally suited to healing professions that required intimate awareness of patient physiology. In return, during moments when pain medication and natural healing had restored enough clarity for extended conversation, Dominic found himself talking about Earth, about humanity's chaotic expansion into the stars driven by population pressure and resource depletion, about the desperation underlying human territorial claims that Sylvari forces had perceived as aggressive encroachment on sovereign space. He articulated things he'd never fully voiced before, how the war felt completely different from ground level, compared to strategic briefings that presented conflict as necessary territorial defense, how he joined military service to protect his younger sister back on Earth, but increasingly questioned what protection actually meant when it involved killing people who probably had siblings of their own waiting for them to come home safely. Veslyn listened with attention that felt qualitatively different from intelligence gathering or tactical interrogation, more like genuine attempt to understand perspectives fundamentally different from her own cultural context. Our peoples went to war over resource allocation and territorial boundaries, she said one night when pain had kept them both awake, her monitoring his vital signs more from professional habit than immediate medical necessity at this stage of recovery. But individuals go to war for much more personal reasons: protection of loved ones, duty to community, sometimes simply because warfare is all they've known and peace seems more foreign than combat. I wonder what would happen if more soldiers from both our species could have this. She gestured around the softly glowing tent. This protected space, to see each other as individual people with hopes and fears, rather than merely as targets requiring neutralization or threats requiring elimination. Dominic considered the proposition while watching bioluminescent panels cast shifting shadows that reminded him of moonlight through trees back on Earth during childhood camping trips before everything became about military service and survival. They'd probably court-martial us both for unauthorized fraternization with enemy combatants, he said, attempting humor despite recognizing the serious undertone beneath his words. Veslyn's expression shifted into what he'd learned to recognize as her version of amusement, subtle movements around her eyes and ears that translated roughly to human smiling. Probably, she agreed with something like wry acceptance. But perhaps that reveals more about failures of our respective leadership than about us as individuals choosing compassion over continued violence. Dominic's recovery reached the point where he could stand without assistance, walk short distances without excessive pain, and according to Sylvari medical evaluation standards, represented someone sufficiently healed to be transferred through proper prisoner exchange protocols that would return him to human military command and presumably new combat assignments, once bureaucracy processed his status. The realization hung heavy in the tense bioluminescent atmosphere. This suspended peace, this small protected space where they'd built something fragile and unexpected, had a rapidly approaching expiration date that neither could prevent despite wishes otherwise. The night before his scheduled transfer, Veslyn performed final medical examinations with unusual quietness, her normally constant professional commentary replaced with silence that felt weighted with unspoken thoughts and suppressed emotions. Dominic broke the silence first because someone had to, and he'd never been particularly good at leaving important things unsaid, even when saying them created complications. What happens to you after I leave? Will your people question why you invested so much medical resources and personal effort in saving an enemy soldier's life, when those same resources could have treated more Sylvari wounded or advanced more strategically valuable objectives? She continued her examination, checking plasma burn scars with gentle precision that spoke of medical expertise developed through years of practice. Perhaps some will question, she acknowledged, But I took oaths when I completed healer training. I treat whoever needs treatment regardless of political affiliation or species classification, or any other criteria beyond medical necessity. Most Sylvari understand this principle, even if military command sometimes questions the tactical efficiency of such universal compassion. She met his gaze directly, her elongated ears shifting forward in ways he'd learned indicated serious attention. And you? What will you tell your superiors about the enemy medic who saved your life using technology and techniques that human military intelligence would very much like to understand better? What information will you provide about neutral zone medical facilities that could compromise locations we've worked hard to keep protected from renewed combat operations? It was the question Dominic had been avoiding thinking about directly, but now had to face with complete honesty, because Veslyn deserved that much at minimum after everything she'd done for him. By all tactical logic and military protocol, he should provide detailed intelligence about Sylvari medical capabilities, about neutral zone facility locations and operations, about anything that might give human forces advantages in continued warfare against her people. But the thought of transforming this experience, of weaponizing Veslyn's compassion and professional dedication into tools for killing more of her species, made something deep in his chest constrict with what he recognized as profound moral shame. I'll tell them I received standard prisoner-of-war medical treatment and was released through proper exchange channels, he said finally, knowing he was consciously choosing to omit tactically valuable information, but finding himself completely unable to regret that decision. I won't mention you specifically or provide details about this facility's location that could compromise its protected neutral status. Veslyn's expression softened into unmistakable gratitude mixed with something else, recognition perhaps that they were both choosing trust over tactical advantage, both deciding that some principles mattered more than military duty or strategic objectives. When the war ends, she began, then stopped and corrected herself with grim realism born of 3 years watching conflict continue without meaningful progress toward resolution. If the war ends, perhaps our peoples will find ways to build more spaces like this tent. Places where we engage in dialogue instead of combat, where we heal instead of harm, where we recognize shared humanity, or at least shared capacity for compassion across species boundaries. Dominic sat up carefully, his healing ribs protesting slightly but pain now manageable rather than debilitating. "I'd like that," he said with complete sincerity. "I'd like to see you again when we're not defined primarily by which side of a meaningless territorial dispute we happen to be born on." The admission felt simultaneously dangerous and liberating. Transport arrived at dawn, human military efficiency coordinating with Sylvari precision to ensure the exchange happened without incident or renewed hostilities. As Dominic prepared to leave, gathering the few personal effects that had survived the battle, Veslyn pressed something small into his hand. A medical data chip containing his complete treatment records, but also, he strongly suspected, something more personal that she couldn't risk saying aloud with other personnel nearby. "Survive," she told him quietly, echoing her first words when he'd initially regained consciousness days ago. "And remember that the first thread of trust between our peoples was woven here in this tent, between a soldier who chose mercy over tactical efficiency and a healer who returned that compassion when circumstances reversed. Remember that peace is built from individual choices as much as political treaties." As the transport lifted away, and the glowing tent shrank to a small point of blue-green bioluminescent light against alien landscape, Dominic gripped the data chip tightly and made a promise to himself that if he survived this war he would find ways to weave more threads of trust and understanding, to expand this small space of peace until maybe,